add the loan to original loan. So let's say you owe 8% per year on $100 that you borrow. Instead of paying $8, you add it to 100. So it amounts to 808. We'll get to that also later. Okay, so I said this in the first slide, but there's really a reason why this matters. So I know none of us are actually employees at a certain company yet, but will be about to. And when you approach the age where you're about to retire, you assign a portion of your income into something called defined benefit funds. And defined benefit funds is you're setting aside money to give to a company so they can pay you back after you retire. So it depends on companies, but some of the things include stock options, some of them includes cash payments to you as soon as you retire until you die. That's called DB plan, in short. The private credit market size is above $2 trillion. This was by 30th yesterday, so we don't know. I have just rough numbers. And we have 5 regulators. What does it mean? I'll get to that later. But I wanted to just give you guys some previews of what it is. And we'll get into some leverage. That's really severe. So I mentioned about corporate DB plans. So it all starts from here. When you retire, the corporations pay you money. Now, if corporations have to pay money to you, it's a liability for them. Right. That's called pensions. Now, during the 2022, the COVID era, when the interest rate spiked, the liabilities that the banks hold decreased in value. Why? Because you have to discount your liabilities to the present value. And we all know that when the discount rates are high, then your liability today is low. Now, what happens then is you get into the status called funded status being positive. I'm not going to get into details, but it's saying this: because liability values are decreasing, you owe less. That's it. That's as simple as it gets. So they have some excess cash at hand. Because if you have $100 of liabilities, you have to match it with $100 of assets. They usually become treasuries and investment grade bonds. That's the regulation. Now let's say the liabilities decrease in value to $90. You can only hold $90 in assets. So where does the excess $10 of cash go? They just use it. Where? That's where the insurance company comes in. You spend that $10 of assets, and you pay it to insurance company in exchange for the transfer of your obligation. So in short, here's this. If you have an excess cash at hand, because the liability is decreased, you might be thinking, okay, I have some excess cash at hand, I can use this. Why don't I give it to insurer and give all my obligation and liability and give all my burden? I would do that if you have some excess cash. And the organization that does that insurance position is Athene. Now I'm using this company as an example. We'll get to what Apollo is, but to give you a brief preview, Athene is owned by Apollo, a PE fund company. So here's what they do. They give the insurance company some money. Why? Because you're handing off a burden that you have. So you have to give them some cash. And then it's not you anymore that pays the retirees the annuities. It's the insurance company now that has this liability and pays you every year. So everything fine. Now there's Apollo Credit that I mentioned that owns Athene. So this whole bilateral visual is really simple. It's happening at the same time. So all of us know that what BDC is, private credit fund is. You guys could be familiar with KKR and Blue Owl and stuff. What they do is that they give loans to the companies that are in financial distress, or companies that need a turnover or spin-off. So these companies, company ABC that I said, is highly indebted. So all the LBOs that you guys probably have heard from, like those Wall Street Oasis videos, is really these companies that need money. So here's what happens. They give you a, let's say, $700 million loan to the highly indebted company because they need money. In exchange, you get a high yield loan interest payments. Why? Because companies borrow money and they have to pay you back every year. But it's high yield. It's not like treasuries or investment grade bonds. Why? Because companies is highly indebted, right? It's risky investment. So you have to pay whoever the lender is a good amount of money. Everything good so far. And there we have Bermuda Offshore Captive. What it does is this. Athene, what it does is gives obligations and the assets that are backing those liabilities. By the way, I have to repeat it again. If you have an insurance liabilities, what the US regulation does is that it requires you to have a backing safe bonds or assets. And safe assets are usually treasuries or investment grade bonds. Right, so on their balance sheet, when you're looking at the T table, they have safe grade bonds, investment grade, treasuries, and then pension obligations or liabilities. What they're doing is they're giving that whole thing to Bermuda Offshore Captive. So let's look at the balance sheet of Bermuda Offshore Captive. So on their balance sheet, they have investment grade bonds and treasuries on their asset side. And liabilities, they have pension obligation. It's just liabilities. In exchange, they give some money back. Now, here's what happens. Bermuda Offshore has now investment grade bonds and safe assets. They sell these to the open market. The open market is where the treasuries and bonds are traded. They sell this. And they get cash back. Right? Simple transaction. Sorry for the stupid transition. Okay, so they have some cash at hand now. Now, what they do is that, remember, Apollo Credit has made the loan to Company ABC. So what do they have? They have high yield loans on their balance sheet. What Bermuda does is that it buys from Apollo Credit. So high yield loans, the risky investments that Apollo Credit has, Bermuda buys them. And of course, oh shit. Yeah, pays them, right? So the assets after this transaction is really looking like this. High yield loans, private credit. Now, of course, you get a return by investing in treasuries and safe assets. That really ranges to 4%, right? Because interest rate is around, what, 375 basis point or so. So you get about 4%. That's really such a boring investment and returns. So what they do is they switch you to high yield loans that give you 11% a year. Perfect. Nothing wrong here. Like, it's just a beautiful transaction. Now, here's the thing though. Apollo Credit owns Athene, we all got that, but it also owns Bermuda Offshore Captive. So it owns everything that you see on the slide except the DB plans and Company ABC. Now, even if Bermuda buys the high yield loans and put it on their balance sheet, Apollo Credit gets the asset under management fees every year. It should not happen in regular settings, but because Apollo owns Bermuda, it's possible. So here's a cycle. They get more pensions, they get more annuities, they get more funded reinsurance, so they give more loans, more fees, repeat. Now, one thing that I would take a careful look at is that Apollo Credit gets a cash payment back. And Athene gets a cash payment back by just transferring assets. And here's an important part. I know there's some red wordings on the top, but just focus on the Company ABC for now. Now you can see the Company ABC, as I said, has 5 to 7 times debt to EBITDA leverage. It means that if you earn $10 a year, you owe about $70 a year, which is enough to be called a financial distress. So who regulates that? Sector regulator in the US. Now let's take a look at the Apollo Credit now. When Apollo Credit makes a loan to these companies, they can use the leverage of twice the debt to equity ratio. So if they're making $700 loan, they can only have $350 equity. That's as simple as it is. just twice the leverage. And here's what they do that's interesting and also frightening. There's a valuation technique called mark-to-model technique. What it does, okay, so before mark-to-model, there's mark-to-market, which is when you have an asset, you just go to the market website or whatever Bloomberg terminal and just see the current spot price of whatever asset class you have. That's mark-to-market, because you're looking at the market. Mark-to-model is you use internal models to value the asset value that you have. So it's internal marking. So nobody sees it. Nobody comes in and checks on you. No IRS. It's just your company and your board members or whatever just makes the valuations. Okay, so just think about it. If you were the PE fund CEO and you're using mark-to-model, you would mark the asset values at 100%. Right, because why would you downgrade it to 80%? Because nobody sees it. You can just keep it at 100. That's what's happening. And PIK, or payment in kind, I've mentioned that. It's just adding the amount you owe in interest on top of the loan that you already owe. And that's called phantom cash or phantom income. And guess what? If their asset under management grows, their asset under management fees grow. So that's why when you see a stock price chart for private equity funds, then you will see that a great price increase is due to this phantom cash or income. Yeah, and you might be wondering why does this whole Bermuda thing comes in? Well, it's because of this. U.S. regulates through its own regulatory system. Bermuda doesn't. It uses something called BMA. Okay, so let's say you owe $100 in liabilities. In U.S., you have to have $3 to $8 in capital, which is about 3 to 8%. In Bermuda, if you have the same liabilities, you can only have $1.50 to continue your operations. So that's about 50% or higher deduction in required capital. What it does, it frees up insurance companies to make more loans. That's what the red part in the middle is saying. And here's what I feel as okay, so far, it might not frighten you as much as it did to me, but take a look at the banks that you have your checking accounts and savings accounts at. They make loans to private companies like Apollo Credit through something called loan to value advance rate. And I wrote down 25 to 30%. What it means is this. When I want to lend you, let's say Max has $50 needed. I can only ask them for, let's say Max owns $100. What I can do is I can give him $25 to $30 only. Right, that's what these advanced fancy looking ratio is saying. If Max owns $100 in cash, I can lend him $25 to $30. That's really it. So take a look at it. Bottom line is there's 5 layers of leverage and there's 5 different regulators. That's why the thing is growing endlessly. And summing up the whole leverage ratios, it's about 7.6 to 12 times the leverage, which is huge. Take a look at the software. About 26% of the private equity funds are invested in software companies. And if you look at the iShares software ETF, it has been plummeting. So we don't know where it will stop. These are some new informations that have been updated as of March 30th. To sum it up, it's really that investors are demanding redemptions and private equity funds are blocking redemptions. That's what's happening. In the most simplified answer, that's what's happening. And we don't know when this redemption blocking stops, if that will actually cause the cycle to break. And we don't know when, because there's 5 different regulators for 5 different leverages. That's really it, I think. If you have any questions, I think we have to continue with the rest of the slides. So you can always come up to me to ask any questions. Thank you.